both Arnold and Redshift and RenderMan and pretty much like most renderers now have these. Basically what they do is it allows you to basically have much more interesting, nice looking light profiles. So I went through, and if you downloaded the little flashlight folder, this is what I'm going to be working in, but in the source images, I just have this little IES lights pack with all of these random little files in it. So normally when you download an IES light pack, it's going to show you, the decent ones are going to have the IES file. This is what you're going to plug into Maya. And it's also going to show you a preview, a little rendered preview of the profile of that light. And you can see that there's like a bunch of really weird, interesting effects that these lights have. But you can use these to basically make your lighting look much more interesting, more realistic, and they don't really take any more or less time to render than your standard lights.
Wait, so how do you put IES lights?
How do you put them in?
Yeah.
I'll show you in a sec. Honestly, there's like a few places that you can go. So like Leo Moon has these. This is like where I downloaded those from. If I ever need to find these online, I'll usually just sort of go through and just legitimately just Google like IES light download, and it'll come up with like a bunch of different stuff. So again, I think I got mine from like Leo Moon, but like pretty much download them from most, like a lot of places have these things. So I'm not expecting you to like make your own or anything, although you can if you want to. If you want to actually throw in an IES light, so it's actually pretty straightforward. So for the case of Arnold, just go down to your lights menu and add in a photometric light. So by default, if I go to render this, you can see it's actually not doing anything. And it's not like an intensity thing, like I don't need to turn up the brightness of the light. These just don't work unless you map in some kind of file into them. So if I click on my light, just go into the attribute editor, you can see that it's like, where's my photometry file? I don't know how you actually pronounce that, but basically this is where you're going to plug in that little IES file that I showed you before. So if I click on that, I'll just find one of my light pack. I like pears. Let's try pear. Well, that's a bad example. But you can see that as soon as I map that in, it's actually started rendering the light in the scene. In this case, the light is pointing straight downwards, so I'm just going to go ahead and rotate that out to the side, and this is literally the most boring light I possibly could have demoed this on. Fantastic. All right, I'm going to try taking the intensity up a little bit. I'm going to choose a different one that's like actually interesting. These are all uninteresting. Wait. All right. I know for a fact that this one is like ridiculous looking. All right, sort of. But you can see, so again, basically just by mapping in these files, I get different shapes of that light if you're looking at it from the side. If you look at it where I point the light straight at the ground, you can see that it's doing this like weird little thing where it's sort of making like a bullseye target effect. But you can get a lot of really interesting effects from these. Does anyone have any questions about like how to just like set these up off the bat?
No, can you do it again?
No. Yes. All right. So delete this light. Pretty much just if you go to Arnold lights, anything like same process as adding an area light or like a dome light. The light you want is photometric light. So once you throw that in the scene, it's not actually going to render until you map in a file into this little photometry file. Just go in and just, grab a random light. I'll try star. And, all right, I might need to refresh my render view or just move my light. Or I can make sure my light's not in the middle of the floor.
Talk about a starry night.
What?
Talk about a starry night.
Okay. Sorry. I actually like this one a lot. It's pretty cool. But like, so again, so this might be something interesting to use in like a, a wall sconce or something like that, where it's like shining a weird profiled light on the wall. You can also, same thing, you could, if you wanted to, you go back and like change the color of the light, use color temperature if you wanted, to sort of fiddle with things that way. Well, that's aggressive. So again, any questions on just setting up an IES light? All right. I do have some very questionable and sketchy little renders I did of a flashlight, just as a demo. Crap, I'm gonna have to put these in Photoshop, aren't I? Damn it. This is the worst thing ever. I emailed IT and I was like, hey, like I can't open image files, and they're like, well, look into it, and I'm like, do it faster. So I made these little renders. So this is just a default area light that I threw into the flashlight. There's nothing inherently wrong with this. It's fine. It looks like a light. But then you go to something like this and you're like, wow, that's 80 billion times more interesting looking and also kind of more realistic. So again, I just sort of like tried it with a bunch of different lights. Depending on the lights you use, you might need to change the intensity pretty dramatically between them. I noticed like this one I had to set with an intensity of like 50, and then this guy was like 200 to get this effect, which is kind of weird. But again, they just look nicer. So there are, like I mentioned, a lot of times they'll be used for stuff like architectural renderings. If you just Google IES lights, you get a bunch of stuff that comes up, but it's mostly just like different profiles of the lights that they included in the packs. But you can see, so like here's an example of basically someone has used IES lights to create different little effects on these like little shiny globe guys. Here's a version where they've, you know, created something more realistic for little overhead lights in a different room. So they're really good for this kind of stuff. That's super trippy and weird, and I like it. But you know, achieving something like this with just area lights would drive you absolutely nuts. And the cool thing about IES lights as well is that as you rotate them around and change their different views, it actually changes, you know, the profile and shape of the light. So it's a little bit more modular than just sort of having to go in and like maybe manually make a map of intensity or something like that for the light. But yeah, so that's pretty much IES lights. Setting them up in Redshift is basically the exact same process, where you would just go through, where am I going? Holy crap. See if we have Redshift today. We don't have Redshift today. Amazing. But it pretty much is exactly the same process where it'll just ask you, just go to your Redshift tab, go down to lights. Unless I'm going crazy, it's also just called Photometric Light. And then you would just plug in the little file, IES file, the same way. Again, pretty much exactly the same process. So any questions on photometric lights? All right. Cool. They're like honestly fairly straightforward. I totally recommend them, especially for random students. You can also use them to bake in interesting lighting into your Unity scenes. But yeah, so the next thing that I wanted to go over is just a little bit about global illumination. So I made, and this is again just if you happen to be in the flashlight folder, I think I'm looking in images like GI tests. Yes, these hideous files. Oh, they're gonna be so ugly. All right, so I did a little mock-up in both Redshift and Arnold in this on my home computer, which is why there is watermarking all over the Redshift ones, because I don't have a real license of it. Cough. Alright, so basically what GI is, it stands for Global Illumination, and it's basically, I just think of it as adding in bounce light. So in the case of, you know, if one of the comments I made on some of the lighting stuff from last week is, it feels like if it's a day lighting and the light's coming straight into the room, you still would expect the wall with the light behind it to have lights on, or like to have light visible on it, right? So like in this case, I mean, barring the fact that the computers are all tiny light sources, if we're looking at this room in particular, effectively right now there's one source of light, and that's coming from the single open window in the space. And you notice, like, if you look at the wall above said window, it's still light, like it's not falling into complete blackness. And that's because basically the light is coming in, bouncing off the walls and the other stuff in the room, and then going back and hitting that wall and lighting it up a little bit. And that's what global illumination allows you to do. So Arnold by default actually has this just turned on randomly. It starts you at like 1 bounce. So if you turn off global illumination in a scene, this is pretty much what you get. And it's really ugly, right? So like I think I just put like one random area light or something just like hanging out right here, shining on the sphere. But you'll notice like half the sphere is completely black, the shadow is completely black, the wall is just, this is an ugly image. So this is what Arnold defaults you to, with basically one ray or like one bounce of global illumination. So you'll notice that if I toggle between these, with global illumination turned on, I can now actually see this wall, which is nice. And then there's also some of the red from this wall being reflected onto the ball. There's that little, have you guys taken the VSST class yet where they force you to just draw like shiny spheres all day and they're like bounce light. There's bounce light under the like bottom of the ball, it's not just black. Like you're getting that. I don't know, I just remember that was like a weird thing they made us draw like 5 different spheres for homework one day. I'm like, this is horrible. And again, you can see, so like even on this little ball, there's some reflection from the red. The shadows are tinted ever so slightly green from this wall. So you just get, again, more of the sort of bounce light effect. If you go in and turn the settings up, so this is with 5 samples of global illumination, you can see that, so here's 1 and 5. The bounce light from the floor is way more intense. There's way more green on this ball and way more red on this ball. You're also, it looks like, getting a little bit of sort of red bounce light in the shadows of this box here. So that's more or less quick overview of like what global illumination is. It works really well, so it makes your renders take way longer. But since you guys are only doing like 5 or 6 renders for your finals, especially anim kids, it's probably worth just sort of turning this on, because it's going to make your lighting look a lot more realistic, and you're going to actually have to jump through way less hoops to get that to be nicer looking. Like I said, so it's really good for stuff like if I had a window right here, basically just a single light source coming into my room. If I turned on GI or global illumination, it's going to automatically light up this wall for me and add just sort of, again, more realistic looking bounce light, but it's also, I'm not gonna have to go like add in, you know, a manual light down here to like fake this bounce light, or like a red light here to fake this red glow, or a giant, very soft area light to fake light on this green wall. GI is pretty much just going to do all of that for you automatically. So are there any questions just like on what global illumination is or like what it does? All right. For grins, since I have them here and have them handy, these are the versions that I did in Redshift. You can see they pretty much look more or less exactly the same. Why am I putting these in Maya? That's a weird decision. Sure. Again, they're just watermarks. So in case any of you guys are wondering what a watermark is, for the record, I will totally take off points if I see giant text that says Redshift or Arnold on your files. So again, particularly for the batch renders this week, or for the turntable renders, if you're using Arnold, use render sequence. If you're using Redshift, you can use batch render, that's fine. And then in general, if you're using Redshift and then you want to switch, like, it'll watermark anything that you use with a trial license, which is what I have on my laptop. So if you guys work at home with a watermarked Redshift, you can bring it into the labs and render it on a computer with an actual license, and it will just get rid of this watermark. But yeah, so this is pretty much, again, more or less same setup in Redshift. So this is no global illumination. This is a lot of global illumination, and this is a little bit. So it pretty much ends up looking the same as Arnold in the end. This still renders way faster, but that's more or less global illumination. So I'm going to run through really quick and just show you guys how to set this up. So if anyone's following along, I'm going to find wherever the heck, somewhere in here, don't ask me why, but for some reason I think I put a Maya file in my source images, like in my IES light pack. So yeah, so if you guys are following along, this is flashlight, go into source images, go into your IES light pack, and I've put Maya files there like a dingus. But I'm just going to grab AI GI test version 1. Don't save. So you can see here's my like really horrendous looking little box setup thing that we have here. And the only light in that scene is literally just this one little area light hanging out on the side. So for Arnold, ouch. Like I said, it defaults you if I don't know what my render settings are right now. Might have changed this. Yeah, so Arnold by default uses one ray of global illumination for everything. So again, you can see a little bit of that like red coming through on the ball there. And for some reason, don't ask me why, I'm going to go through and make my image smaller, but the settings to edit your global illumination are in, basically if you go under Arnold Render, the same place you would look for like, modifying your global sample settings. If you scroll down, it's not in the sampling tab, if you scroll down to the ray depth tab, this is basically where you fiddle with global illumination. So in this case, what you're looking for is diffuse and specular. That's going to add bounce lights on that. They have the, if you have like transmission or volume, they have that turned up a little bit higher because glass you need more samples to make it look not trashy. But just standard global illumination, again, diffuse and specular under the ray depth tab is what you want to play with. So if I'm just going to open my render view and get this playing. So again, this is the Arnold default. If I set diffuse and specular down to 0, you can see it renders incredibly faster. However, it looks like trash. Like this is pretty much what you would expect if you're for some reason trying to recreate the look of default Maya lighting. Don't know why you would be, but if you were, just turn off global illumination and it gets you somewhere kind of close. So normally, like you can edit this depending on, how much bounce light you want in the room. So the higher you set this, it's going to kind of, basically just add in more bounce light. Your light is going to bounce off more things before it stops calculating it, which is going to lead to more color blending, like from the red of this wall bouncing onto this little ball here. And that's like honestly pretty much fiddling with global illumination in Arnold. It is literally more or less just a matter of like playing with these two sliders to achieve the effect that you want. So usually if I'm just trying to like do something that looks decent, I'll set it somewhere between maybe 3 and 5. Setting it to 16 like I've done now is wickedly excessive. But again, so modifying this in Arnold, it's on by default, and it's under the ray depth tab, like right below where you normally edit your samples. And you can see that, God, these computers are fast. So I set my computer when I was rendering this to, granted I was rendering an image 4 times the size, but it took me like 5 or 10 minutes to render with 5 samples, and this one's like 16 samples, boom, 20 seconds, which is lovely. But anywho, so any questions about how to set up global illumination in Arnold? All right, it's more or less similar in Redshift. I might actually go through just really quick and reset up the stupid files and see if I can get Redshift showing up on my computer. So again, if you guys ever need to do this, just go to, Dig'em Share is real full. Wow. Wait, I love how Dig'em Share is like, it's almost full. You have 300 gigabytes left. But damn, out of 17 terabytes, that's intense. Yeah, no, Dig'em Share is terrifying. This is why I don't use Dig'em Share, because it just like always fills up and I don't want to deal with it. But if you go under my faculty tab in Dig'em Share, just grab this little Maya ENV file, copy it, don't steal it, just copy it. Go to Documents, Maya, whatever version you're working in, and take this little Maya ENV, delete it, paste in the file for my user. When you do this, you have to close and then restart Maya for the changes to actually take effect. So hopefully I will actually have Redshift installed on this computer, and I will now be able to find it in the plugin manager. Let's find out. All right. This is always a crapshoot. I'm like always afraid I'm going to come in and be like, oh great, like nothing works anymore. All right. The lag is real. I'll also show you guys if you guys, so I'm just going to go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, Plugin Manager. I have Redshift. Load. Huzzah. I'll also show you guys the plugin for Arnold. If you guys ever, for some reason, go onto a computer and it's just like doesn't have the Arnold plugin, we have Redshift. So Redshift, somewhat logically, calls the plugin Redshift for Maya. If you ever don't have Arnold, the plugin is not called Arnold. You need to look for MTOA. Don't ask me why, but MTOA is the plugin for Arnold. So if you ever don't see that installed, just look for the MTOA plugin. Again, don't know why it's called MTOA, but it is. It took me like 10 minutes of Googling to find that too, and I was just like, oh my god. Alright, so I'm gonna wander back, and this time I'm going to go into my, still under the IES Light Pack in my source images for some reason. I'm just gonna grab the Redshift GI test. Pretty much exactly the same scene, just set up for Redshift instead of Arnold. So, let us see what we have here. Well, that's appealing. What are you doing? Okay, that was weird. Alright, so you can see that I already have GI turned on in this particular render. So Arnold, there is actually, if I go into my render settings, or, I'm sorry, Redshift, if you go into your render settings, switch the render using from Arnold to Redshift, and you'll notice that they do actually have a separate tab just for global illumination. So by default, it's set, this is like pretty much the settings here, I think. So this is, again, render with no GI at all. Looks kind of wonky, and like this whole corner is just completely black. So there's like 3 settings that you usually just use for this. So for primary GI engine, usually you want to set that to photon map. It's going to give you kind of like, in my opinion, the nicest GI. So you can see as soon as I turn that on, it does give me a little bit of like bounce light up here. That wall sort of starts to come into more focus. And then secondary GI engine, usually I'll just set that to brute force. And set the brute force GI to something maybe like 16. You can kind of play with this depending on the number of samples and stuff you need. If I scroll in really close, you can see, really close, you can see that it's still rendering. Like, it's just goes through very, very slowly and pretty much keeps testing each pixel to find an average value, and it takes forever to do, and I didn't want to let it finish on my renders, so they're kind of grainy, but you just gotta kind of let it sit for a while, and then like eventually it'll finish. But you can see like it's still just going through and like systematically calculating pixels. But it does give you, you know, nice effects with GI. So if you wanted to, you could also like fiddle around with some of the other settings. They're honestly, half of them are like fairly similar in my opinion. Like I don't notice a huge difference between photon map and brute force. This is just sort of like photon map is supposed to be like the nicest one that you use or whatever, but again, I don't notice a huge difference. But that's, again, pretty much if you're in Redshift, they do actually in the render settings have a real person tab for GI instead of like hiding it under your samples tab. And it is not turned on by default. So you do need to go in and like turn on the rest of this stuff. But that's honestly pretty much GI in Redshift. Are there any questions about that? All right. Any questions about GI as a whole? Because that's pretty much what I had for it. It's like fairly straightforward, I think, hopefully. All right. Cool. I think I did actually have like, oh no, that was a different thing, sorry. All right, so I think the only other thing that I like really had to go over with you guys is I found a silly hack, which isn't really a silly hack, but if I've ever like commented on your stuff and wait, I put these in all the wrong places. Sorry, I organized my files very poorly. Alright, cool. Here we go. Alright, so if you guys are ever, you know, if I've ever looked at your stuff and been like, oh, you know, half your object is black, and it's just because, you know, there's nothing in your scene to actually like reflect back onto your object. There's a dumb hack for that if you don't want to use a HDR map. So in this case, I'm just going to be just to show you like exactly what I'm working with here, I'm going to go into my, just my flashlight scene. I don't really care. Just to show you, so this was pretty much the setup I had for rendering that image of the flashlight. Just like 3 planes just clip through each other like a maniac and 2 lights on it. So there's no like portal lights or anything back here. It's just, you know, Maya void. So if I, by default, go in and render this, it's going to look what are you yelling at me for? Well, that's not helpful. Fine. What if I... Oh. I do have one random photometric light just in here, which apparently is not showing up for some reason. Cough. Jellyfish. Why not? Alternately, I will just turn this off, or not. Okay. So you can see that by default, if I'm focusing mostly on the flashlight here, I, for some reason, was like, I used a flashlight because they're good to show off IES lights, but also I just wanted to model this little grip in here. It's fun. But you can see that there's not like a whole lot of detail here in the like reflections and stuff on this flashlight. It looks like a little bit super boring, honestly. So I found a really quick hack for that. And this is, again, like if you want to mostly set up your own custom lighting and not use an HDR. This is like my dumb hack for just sort of getting reflections in here. So you can see the difference just really quick between, so this is GI, this is same render, both with global illumination. This is without the background hack I'm going to show you guys, and this is with the silly background hack. And you can see the whole image is a little bit brighter, but I do actually have, you know, reflections in here now, which just kind of makes the render look nicer. So this is, again, you can totally use an HDRI, but if you don't want to, like if you want to do your own custom light setup, or if you're just like, I just kind of want to throw a thing in here like just for reflections and not for lighting purposes, what you can do is go in and basically make your own fake dome light that's not actually a light. So I'm just going to make a ginormous sphere on top of my scene, shift it down so it's kind of covering my scene a little bit, and be like, giant sphere. Now what I'm going to do, so I want to be basically inside the sphere as I'm working. I don't want to see the back of the sphere, so I'm just going to do mesh display reverse, so that basically the inside of the sphere is now the quote-unquote correct side of the normals, and it's going to show up in my render. The next thing I'm going to do is assign this a new material, and I would like that material to be a surface shader. So disclaimer, this is like the only default Maya material that I don't completely hate. I wouldn't use it in your main render, but like for stuff like this, it's good. So basically what a surface shader is it is going to render no matter, Alright, so it doesn't matter if you have lights on it or no lights, it's going to render regardless. So if I go into the surface shader, you can see that it's not, clearly it's not in shadow or anything like that, it's just pretty much existing as it is. So what I've done is actually gone in and I'm just going to throw a completely random image file into this. In this case, I literally just used a random picture of a fish tank that I found on my desktop this morning because I didn't feel like finding more files. So in this case, I'm just going to be like, hey, here's a random gas mask JPEG, let's put that in. Cool. So now we have a giant gas mask on the inside of the sphere. Say hello to your creepy overlords. But you can see if I go down that now there's actually some reflection from that image showing up in the flashlight, and it does look a little bit nicer. The reason that this is actually, I think I have GI turned on in this, which would explain why it is suddenly getting lighter. So this is Arnold, so I'm just going to go into my render settings under the ray depth tab and just see what happens if I turn off GI completely. Oh god, that's horrible looking. Wow. Alright, so GI does very nice things apparently for your reflections. But either way, so it did end up, again, lightening the scene because it's just sort of getting, you have more stuff to reflect onto your background. But it's not functioning as a traditional HDRI where it's like casting light on your scene, if that makes sense. So So again, just sort of like a silly, cheap hack if you need just like reflection shining in a particular area. You can just throw in a giant sphere or a plane or whatever with a surface shader, and that's going to basically, you know, add in those reflections if you need them. Any questions on that? Kind of a weird little demo. Cool. I felt like I had more images than that, but I could be going crazy. All right, so portal light. Oh yeah, the other, okay. So I lied. There is one more thing that I had to go over, and then once that's done, I'm just gonna break it up into open lab for the rest of the class, but I also just wanted to go over portal lights really quick. I'm going to, yeah.